What if everything we think we know about the history of human technology is wrong, not slightly off, not missing a few details? Wrong in a way that should fundamentally change how we understand our own past, because scattered across the ancient world are artifacts, weapons, and building techniques that modern science still cannot fully explain or replicate. Technologies that appeared without warning, performed at levels we wouldn't reach again for 1,000 years or more, and then vanished, sometimes overnight, as if someone had decided they shouldn't exist. This isn't fringe theory. This isn't speculation from the internet. This is peer-reviewed science, published in journals, raising questions that nobody in mainstream history is comfortable answering. Tonight, we're going down the rabbit hole. And once you see what's down there, you won't be able to unsee it. Let's start with something hiding in plain sight at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers were caught in a storm off the small island of Antikythera and sheltered nearby. While they waited, one of them descended to the seafloor in his diving suit and came up with something that changed everything: the encrusted remains of a Roman-era shipwreck, loaded with bronze statues, glassware, jewelry, and coins dating to roughly 70 to 60 BC. Most of those artifacts were extraordinary. One of them was impossible. It sat on a shelf in the National Museum in Athens for almost 2 years before anyone paid attention to it. Corroded, barnacle-covered, falling apart in fragments, it looked like a lump of rock. Then, in 1902, an archaeologist named Valerio Stais noticed something in the crust that shouldn't have been there. Gears. Tiny, precisely machined bronze gears interlocked with each other with a sophistication that had no business existing in the ancient world. What Stais had found would eventually be identified as the Antikythera mechanism, a device so advanced that modern researchers, after more than a century of study, have only recently understood what it actually did. And what it did will make your jaw drop. The Antikythera mechanism was a hand-cranked analog computer. It tracked the positions of the sun and moon simultaneously, predicted solar and lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, modeled the irregular orbit of the moon, a phenomenon not fully understood in Western science until the 17th century, and tracked the cycles of the Pan-Hellenic festival games. It did all of this through a system of at least 37 interlocking bronze gears, some with teeth so fine they can barely be seen with the naked eye, working in a gear train so sophisticated that researchers at University College London spent years building a full digital model before they could fully understand how it functioned. The level of engineering it represents didn't reappear in Europe until the 14th century AD. More than 1,300 years later, when the first mechanical clocks were built in medieval monasteries, and even those were far simpler than what someone was building in ancient Greece. Here's what makes this genuinely disturbing rather than merely impressive. The Antikythera mechanism didn't appear out of nowhere. For something like this to exist, there had to be a tradition, workshops, training, accumulated expertise passed from master to apprentice over generations. You don't build a 37-gear analog computer as your first project. Someone built simpler versions first, then more complex ones, for decades, possibly centuries. And yet we have found precisely nothing, not a single other device, not a single artifact, not a single reference in any surviving ancient text that even hints at this tradition of precision engineering existing. Either the entire tradition was lost so completely that not a single piece of evidence survived, or there is something else going on here. Some researchers have proposed that the mechanism came from the tradition of Archimedes, the Greek mathematician reported by Cicero to have built a mechanical model of the solar system with moving parts. If Archimedes built something like the Antikythera mechanism, and his workshop was destroyed when the Romans sacked Syracuse in 212 BC, a documented historical event, then an entire tradition of precision engineering may have burned with it. That's the mainstream theory. The alternative theory, the one that keeps archaeologists awake at night, is simpler and more unsettling. We simply have no idea how much the ancient Greeks actually knew, because most of it is gone. Now let's talk about a weapon that set the sea on fire, and whose secret died with an empire. In 678 AD, a massive Arab fleet approached Constantinople to end the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were outnumbered and backed against the walls of their own capital. Then from bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine shipbows came something liquid, something burning, something that clung to everything it touched and couldn't be extinguished with water. It burned on the surface of the sea itself. It spread when water hit it. Sailors who jumped overboard to escape found it following them across the water. The Arab fleet was annihilated. Constantinople survived, and the weapon responsible, known as Greek fire, became the most closely guarded military secret in the history of the world. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII told his son that the formula for Greek fire had been revealed by an angel to the founder of the empire, and that God himself commanded it never be shared with foreign powers. This wasn't just religion. It was the most sophisticated security classification system of the medieval world. Well, the formula was compartmentalized so tightly that the engineers who built the delivery systems didn't know what they were pumping, and the chemists who mixed the components didn't know how they were deployed. No single person except the emperor himself knew all of it. The Byzantines kept this secret for almost 5 centuries. It helped them win naval battles that should have been losses. It created a wall of liquid fire around Constantinople that made the city nearly impregnable from the sea. Emperor Romanos II declared that 3 things must never reach foreign hands: the Byzantine imperial regalia, any royal princess, and Greek fire. The first 2 were occasionally bestowed on foreign rulers as diplomatic gifts. The third never was. And then, sometime around the end of the 12th century, the secret simply vanished. Not stolen, not captured, lost. The chain of transmission broke, possibly during the political chaos of the Byzantine civil wars, possibly because a key figure died without passing the knowledge on, possibly because the compartmentalization that had kept the secret safe for 5 centuries also meant that no single document existed that contained the whole formula. By the time Byzantine scribes noticed that nobody remembered how to make it, it was already too late. Here's where the conspiracy gets genuinely dark. In the 19th century, in 1854 to be specific, an Armenian inventor named Kavafian approached the Ottoman Empire and claimed to have rediscovered the formula. He offered to sell it to the Sultan. The Ottomans were interested. They wanted to see a demonstration. Kavafian agreed. And then before the demonstration could take place, Kavafian was found dead. He had been poisoned. Ottoman imperial agents searched his home, his laboratory, his papers. They found nothing. Whatever Kavafian had rediscovered, or believed he had rediscovered, died with him. To this day, nobody knows the exact formula for Greek fire. The best modern guess, based on analysis of surviving accounts describing its behavior, is that it was petroleum-based, naphtha from the Crimea, mixed with resins and quicklime that caused an exothermic reaction when it hit water, which is why water made it burn hotter instead of extinguishing it. But that's still a guess. Modern chemists have built systems that approximate what Greek fire reportedly did. None of them have been able to fully replicate it, something that won wars for 500 years, something an empire declared a divine gift. And it's just gone. But here's the question nobody asks loudly enough. Are we certain that the Byzantines lost it by accident? Because the same thing happened in Egypt more than 1,000 years earlier, and in Rome And in ancient India, the pattern of advanced technology appearing, performing feats we struggle to replicate, and then disappearing, sometimes suddenly, repeats itself across multiple civilizations, multiple centuries, multiple continents, with a frequency that starts to feel less like coincidence and more like something else. We know the Romans had concrete. You've seen Roman concrete. It's everywhere. The Pantheon, the Colosseum, harbor walls that have spent 2,000 years beneath the Mediterranean and are still structurally sound. And this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable for modern material scientists, because what the Romans built with their concrete is something our concrete can't do. In 2017, a team of researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a study in the journal American Mineralogist. They had taken samples of Roman marine concrete that had been sitting underwater for more than 2,000 years, and analyzed it at the molecular level using X-ray beams at the Advanced Light Source Particle Accelerator. What they found should have made headlines everywhere, but mostly didn't. The Roman concrete wasn't just surviving underwater, it was getting stronger. When seawater percolated through the ancient mixture over centuries, it triggered a slow crystallization reaction, forming a rare mineral called tobermorite, a calcium aluminum silicate hydrate crystal that grew inside microscopic cracks in the concrete, sealing them from the inside out. These crystals didn't just fill gaps. They interlocked with the surrounding material in a way that increased structural integrity with every passing decade of submersion. The ocean, the very environment that destroys modern concrete within 50 years, was actively strengthening Roman concrete over centuries. Our modern concrete doesn't do this. It can't do this. Portland cement, the basis of virtually every concrete structure built in the last 2 centuries, reacts with seawater by corroding its steel reinforcement, cracking from the inside, and eventually failing in a process that is effectively irreversible. The most expensive marine infrastructure in the world, harbor walls, offshore platforms, coastal bridges, is built with the quiet assumption that it will need to be rebuilt within a single human lifetime. Roman harbor walls have lasted 2,000 years. So why aren't we using Roman concrete? The short answer is that the complete recipe has been lost. We can read Vitruvius, the 1st century Roman architect who wrote extensively about construction materials. We know the broad strokes: volcanic ash from the Pozzuoli region near Naples, called pozzolana, mixed with seawater and lime, packed around chunks of volcanic rock, but knowing the ingredients isn't the same as knowing the process. MIT chemist Admir Masick spent years studying lime clasts inside Roman concrete samples and discovered that the Romans used a process called hot mixing, combining quicklime and volcanic ash dry, then adding water to trigger an explosive exothermic reaction that created temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Celsius inside the forming concrete. Nobody had understood this before. Nobody had thought to look for it. And even now, the specific volcanic ash from Campi Flegrei, which appears central to the self-healing chemistry, cannot be extracted and exported at the scale modern global infrastructure would require. The recipe requires an ingredient that exists in one place on Earth, and we only just figured out why. We had the recipe sitting in ancient texts for 2,000 years and didn't understand what it was telling us. The question isn't whether Romans had superior technology, they clearly did. The question is why. Despite building seawalls that have lasted 2 millennia, we apparently forgot how they did it. Spent nearly 2,000 years building inferior replacements that need constant repair and are only now beginning to reverse engineer something a Roman engineer considered basic. What else have we forgotten? Let's go deeper. In a crypt beneath the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, Egypt, carved into the stone walls sometime around 50 BC, there's a set of 5 relief panels that have been causing arguments between archaeologists and fringe theorists for the better part of a century. The mainstream archaeological interpretation is clear. The reliefs depict the creation myth of Harsamtis, a serpent god shown emerging from a lotus flower enclosed within an oval shape, supported by a Dejid pillar. Religious symbolism, nothing more. But look at those reliefs from a different angle, and something strange happens. The oval shapes look extraordinarily like glass light bulbs. The serpent inside each one looks like a glowing filament. The Dejid pillars at the base look like electrical insulators. And in the same temple crypt, there are objects that closely resemble, to a degree that makes sober engineers genuinely uncomfortable, cable connectors. And then there's this. Egyptian tombs are decorated with intricate, technically sophisticated paintings covering every surface, deep inside chambers, completely sealed from sunlight. And yet multiple archaeological surveys have confirmed there is no soot, no torch residue, no evidence of fire-based lighting. The conventional explanation is reflected sunlight or nearly smokeless oil lamps. Neither has been demonstrated to be fully workable for the depth and complexity of some of these decorated spaces. The question of how ancient Egyptian artists saw what they were painting, deep underground in total darkness, has never been definitively answered. Not far away in modern-day Iraq, archaeologists working near Ctesiphon in 1936 found a set of clay jars that didn't make sense. Inside each jar, a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod. When archaeologists poured vinegar or grape juice into the vessels, they generated a weak but measurable electrical current. Wilhelm Koenig, the director of the National Museum of Iraq, published a paper in 1938 suggesting these were primitive galvanic cells. Batteries, in effect, predating Alessandro Volta's invention of the battery in 1800 by at least 1,800 years. The artifacts became known as the Baghdad Battery. The mainstream counter-argument is that the jars were used for storing papyrus scrolls or holding ritual objects, and that the metallic components happened to be present without electrical purpose. This is possible. It is also true that filling them with acid and connecting them in series produces measurable electrical current. And here the story gets stranger. Analysis of certain ancient artifacts from the same region has found evidence of extraordinarily thin metallic coatings that modern metallurgists find difficult to explain through purely chemical means. Koenig's original hypothesis, that they were used for electroplating, coating metal objects with thin layers of gold or silver through electrical current, has never been conclusively disproven. Were the Dendera reliefs depicting light bulbs? Probably not literally. Were the Baghdad jars ancient batteries used to power them? The science confirms they can generate current, but how they were actually used remains frustratingly incomplete. Consider this. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera housed what ancient texts describe as one of the largest scientific and alchemical libraries in Egypt. Almost all of it is gone. What was in that library? We don't know. We will never know, because the Library of Alexandria burned. Actually, let's be precise about that, because the history is darker than most people realize. The Library of Alexandria didn't burn in a single dramatic fire. It declined over centuries through a series of incidents: Caesar's burning of ships in the harbor that may have spread to adjacent warehouses, damage during the Civil War of 270 AD, destruction under Emperor Theophilus in 391 AD, and a final blow under the Arab conquest in 641 AD. At its peak, it reportedly held nearly 500,000 scrolls, not just literary works, but scientific treatises, mathematical texts, records of engineering that existed nowhere else. Every one of those incidents was a reset button on human knowledge, and nobody at the time understood what was being lost until it was already gone. The ancient Indian texts known as the Mahabharata and Ramayana describe weapons and vehicles that read uncomfortably like modern military technology. The Brahmastra, released by incantation, capable of destroying entire populations, generating intense heat, causing rivers to dry and the sun to darken. Ancient commentators called it divine legend. Anyone who knows what a nuclear weapon does reads those descriptions and feels uneasy in a specific way. The Vimana, flying vehicles described in enough engineering detail that in 1895, an Indian Sanskrit scholar named Shivkar Bapuji Talpade reportedly built a functioning unmanned aircraft based on Vedic texts, demonstrated it over Mumbai harbor, watched it rise 40 feet before it crashed, and then died shortly afterward. His papers and components were reportedly seized by British colonial authorities. The story was largely erased from official histories until Indian researchers rediscovered it in the 20th century. The evidence is contested. What is not contested is that these texts are at least 2,000 years old, and that the descriptions they contain are not vague metaphors. They are specific, technical, and repeated across multiple independent sources. And this is the deepest rabbit hole of all. Because here's what we actually know, stripped of all speculation. We know that ancient Greeks built an analog computing device 2,000 years ago that our best engineers only recently fully understood. We know that Romans built concrete that modern science cannot fully replicate, using techniques sitting in plain sight in ancient texts until MIT researchers reverse engineered them in this century. We know that Byzantines developed a naval weapon that saved their empire for 5 centuries, guarded its formula so tightly it vanished completely, and that at least one person in the 19th century claimed to have rediscovered it and was poisoned before he could demonstrate it. We know that ancient craftsmen in Iraq built devices that generate electrical current. We know that Egyptian tomb artists painted in spaces we cannot account for, illuminating with any conventional method. None of this requires aliens. None of this requires supernatural intervention. It requires something simpler and in some ways more disturbing. The recognition that human knowledge is not a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. It rises and falls. It concentrates in places and then scatters. It gets lost in fires and civil wars and the deaths of single individuals who forgot to write things down. It sits in libraries until those libraries burn. The Antikythera mechanism spent 2,000 years on the bottom of the sea before a sponge diver found it by accident. Roman concrete sat above water for 2 millennia, telling anyone who looked carefully enough that it was getting stronger, not weaker, and nobody asked why until 2017. Greek fire was described in enough detail that we know what it did to water and to ships and to human bodies, and we still can't make it. The question isn't whether the ancients were smarter than us. The question is whether we are arrogant enough to assume that everything worth knowing was first discovered after the Industrial Revolution, and whether that assumption is causing us to misread our own past. History isn't a story of steady progress. It's a story of knowledge appearing, being used, being guarded, being lost, and occasionally being rediscovered by someone who was looking in the right direction at the right moment. And out there, right now, there are things sitting in museums, sitting in untranslated texts, sitting on the bottom of the sea, waiting for someone with the right eyes to look at them. Subscribe to find out what we find next, and let us know in the comments which lost ancient technology disturbs you the most. Because this list, believe us, has barely started.